Welcome to Salam Islamic Center's program. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today our guest is Ustadha Rania Awad. MD is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine, where she is the director of the Muslim Mental Health Lab. She pursued her psychiatric residency training at Stanford, where she also completed a postdoctoral clinical research fellowship with the National Institute of Mental Health. Her research and clinical work are focused on the mental health needs of Muslims. Her courses at Stanford range from teaching a pioneering course on Islamic Psychology, instructing medical students and residents on implicit bias, integrating culture and religion into medical care, to teaching undergraduate and graduate students of the psychology of xenophobia. She is also the clinical director of the San Francisco Bay Area branches of the Khalil Center, a spiritual wellness center pioneering the application of traditional Islamic spiritual healing methods to modern classical psychology. Prior to studying medicine, she pursued classical Islamic studies in Damascus, Syria, and holds certifications ijazah in Quran, Islamic law, and other branches of the Islamic science. Dr. Awad has also served as the first female professor of Islamic law at Zaytuna College, a Muslim liberal arts college in Berkeley, California, where she taught courses on Shafi fiqh and women's fiqh and Quranic sciences for nearly a decade. In addition to all of these, she serves as director of the Rahma Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to educating Muslim women and girls. At Rahma, she oversees the Murbia Spiritual Mentoring Program for girls. Dr. Awad is a nationally recognized speaker, award-winning teacher, researcher, and author in both the Islamic and medical sciences. Thank you, Dr. Awad, for being with us tonight. It's really a great honor to have you here. I'm pretty much surprised to see how you combine the traditional Islamic sciences, where you studied and got the ijazah degree of the Quranic sciences, plus the modern medical psychology training. And it's, mashallah, it's kind of a very pioneering role for Muslims to play, especially in the areas of psychology. Can we say you're one of the first ones to combine all this in the US?
MashaAllah. Well, first, let me say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and to say thank you for having me here with the Salam Center. And to answer your question, perhaps in the US, but certainly not historically.
Alhamdulillah. So it was a kind of a great need for the Muslims in the US to be able to go to someone who's trained traditionally and also got the modern sciences. Our topic is mental health issues in the Muslim community. So now the floor is yours, please.
Thank you again, mashallah. It's again an honor and pleasure to be here today, and I'm really happy to talk about this topic that's really dear to my heart, and one that I have a lot of not just passion about pursuing, but really have dedicated a good bit of my life and career to really focus around. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. When we begin this discussion, which is a really important discussion on what is kind of the Islamic understandings related to mental health, first, I think I want to share with you a little bit about my own story, in short and in very brief, my own journey of how I even got here. Because I think when we talk about my case is kind of a case in point of how so many Muslims feel that the discussion related to psychology, psychiatry, mental health in general, is definitely something that feels like it's outside of our Islamic range, very much a Western construct and very Eurocentric, and something that doesn't fit well with the Muslim model, or needed even. Some people even believe not even needed for the Muslim community. Well, I'll start by saying I was one of those people. In short, I was that person who grew up my entire life also feeling like there really wasn't a place for this. All that was a lot of nonsense. And psychology, in my mind, immediately transferred to Freud, and how that was very nonsensical, so much of what he said. And to the point that even when I was in college, I didn't take a single psychology course, because I felt, what good Muslim girl studies psychology? MashaAllah. only, of course, to see, where I am today. It's a drastically different place, and it's an important place because in that journey, I have discovered so much, and some of which I'm going to hope to share with you today, but I hope you also will discover some of this. And where, to me, it makes the most, the key, really what drives me, is that the advancements the Muslims have made in relation to the field of mental health. If we want to speak of the real pioneers, we look at our noble predecessors that really pioneered this field. So I'll share with you just a little bit and what prompted me. I'll tell you what prompted me. I had studied, as the brother mentioned, I had studied, in Damascus, Syria. I was raised here. I was raised in the U.S. and had the opportunity to go study the Sharia sciences formally in the traditional ijazah process in Damascus, subhanAllah, at a time when Syria was very safe and sound, that a young girl like myself, I'm not Syrian, my parents permitted me to go and study abroad. And it was during my high school years. And eventually I would go back and forth between Damascus and the US to study Islam along with my high school studies, my college studies, eventually my medical school studies. I eventually chose to go into medicine, and even all the way into my residency training up until the time the war started. And the reason I make this point is because I was really drawn to study the Sharia sciences, and very young and very early on, I became a teacher within the community. What happened with that, very quickly in my own personal story, is that in working with the Muslim community, I found as I was teaching, Quran, I was teaching, works of Sirah, I was teaching works of Hadith and Fiqh and Tafsir, the Islamic Sharia sciences. But very soon, once you start teaching the community, people come and the same with imams in our community, they come and actually ask very personal questions. I'm struggling with this, my family is having an issue with this, my child is struggling with this or that. And very quickly I realized I could answer you the fiqh questions and answers, but I didn't have the knowledge or the base really to counsel and to help the situation. In that moment of time, I was planning on going into medical school and really focusing on women and women's health. And subhanAllah, this experience actually shifted me into psychiatry. And in that space, I discovered so much. And I felt like every Muslim who is very proud of our heritage, very proud of the golden age, as we call it, very proud of the advances of medicine, of science, of humanities. And I kept asking myself, if we were so advanced, I was just telling my students this morning that if when I was in medical school in the middle of the Midwest in Ohio, where I went to medical school, and our surgery professor in my surgery rotation in medical school, I'm not Muslim, he held up the surgeon's tools and he said, these were first created by Muslims. These exact same tools, centuries ago. And I thought to myself, subhanAllah, if we were so advanced in all the other sciences and medicine, where was the discussion on mental health? Well, that opened up a big, big, big world for me, subhanAllah, in researching. And I'll share with you why this research is very important, because I came to discover that the very first psychiatric institutions in the world were in the Muslim lands. They took place, the first, as far as we know, within a first Islamic hospital system, a psychiatric ward, and eventually they became standalone institutions under the name of Bimaristan, right, the place of healing, or Shifa. Later in Arabic, they were also called Dar al-Shifa. And these institutions were so important because they started in as early as, some research says, maybe the 7th century, definitely by the 8th century, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and so on and so forth. And you find them all throughout the Muslim world. Not only that, but to think about what the Muslims were accomplishing in, say, the 9th century, compared to what was happening, 8th century, compared to what was happening in Europe at the same time in history. If you remember your history, you'll remember that in the same time of history that Islam is going, that Muslim lands are going through their golden age, Europe is going through its dark ages. And those who have any sort of mental health condition, at best, were being sent to the monasteries to be treated by the nuns, the priests, because people were saying, this is a spiritual issue. Or you have what today we would say jinn possession. This is demonic possession. You need the religious people to take this out of you or to pray upon you. And at worst, they were being burned at the stake as witches. Now, go across the way into the Muslim lands. And here we are, not just what we developed something called humanistic medicine, being very humane in our treatment. Not did we just develop whole institutions of care, but we didn't just focus on the bodily concerns. We also focused on the emotional and mental health concerns. And our scholars wrote a lot about this under not the term psychology, that word didn't exist back then, but under the term called ilmun nafs, the knowledge of the self, the knowledge of the soul. And they created beautiful understanding of the mind and body and how it's connected. And the scholars wrote about this extensively. I could probably spend the whole hour with you just talking just about this point because I'm very passionate about it. But I'll tell you, there are so many Muslims who have no idea about this history. There are so many Muslims, when you ask them, what is psychology? They say, oh, Freud, Western, like I did once upon a time. But my research showed so much drastically different. And it showed that Islam was the impetus, was the spark that allowed this to happen. Why? Because it never happened in history before. And there was Europe in the Dark Ages. So what sparked this? What was this golden era? What sparked this? What sparked this were specific ayat in the Quran that sparked the people of the time to say, and hadith too, and I'll discuss both of them, that really sparked our noble predecessors of the time, the scholars of the time, to really pay attention to these things, to classify them, to diagnose them, to treat them, to build institutions of healing around them, right? The Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, that for those, that for every, that he is the Shafi, right? That he is, that he's going to, going to Yashfin, he's going to be the person who heals us. And the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that specifically says that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends down an illness, he also sends its cure. And cures don't fall out of the sky typically. Cures come from people who experiment and develop and work. And subhanAllah, we're in the COVID-19 era, and look how difficult it's been, not just here, but globally. Because there's no vaccine, there's no cure, we don't know when it's going to happen. But as Muslims, we believe that if Allah sends an illness to mankind, he will also send its cure. How? Through the people who are doing experimentation, researchers, doctors, thinkers, all these people that are coming together to figure this out. This is Allah's promise to us. So our noble predecessors felt the same. So when they saw somebody who was ill, they said, okay, there must be a treatment. Let's try to sort this out. And hence the birth of these Bimadistans, right? These institutions of healing. And not only that, but today, if you go to where I work at Stanford Hospital, we pride ourselves at Stanford and all these other top-notch institutions and hospitals. We pride ourselves on the interdisciplinary care team of the patient. You look at the books of the 8th and 9th and 7th centuries describing the care system that the Muslims created in mental health. They had the doctor, they had the person you would call the nurse, they had the person even that today we might call a social worker, the person who would take, once the person came into the hospital, would take care of their affairs, and once they were discharged, also help them get on their feet. Today that we call that person a social worker. And let me just say one more note about that person, that the hospitals describe that not only was all of this treatment free of charge, but they also allowed on discharge the person to take home with them 3 or 5 dinars, gold dinars. That is a lot of sum of money at the time. 2 of which would allow them to get back on their feet for clothing and shelter, and 3 of which to allow them to start their own business, to get back on their feet. SubhanAllah. That's our tradition. Doctor, nurse, social worker, the person also on the care team who would compound the medication. Today we'd call that person a pharmacist. And the person who makes specific diets for each and every person, we'd call that person the dietitian, nutritionist. And the person who gives religious advice or inquiry, right, nasiha to the person. Today we might call that like the hospital chaplain. That whole interdisciplinary care team, that interdisciplinary care team is the person who I think is really, you think about what the Muslims were able to create at that period of time, it only today matches the same thing. Not only that, but all of this was paid, I said, paid for by what? Our 5 pillars of Islam, one of them is called the zakat, the alms charity. That zakat and the money from Bayt al-Mal was used to pay for these institutions and for the treatment, and was used, earmarked, to help those who needed this help. So subhanAllah, that means not only were we far advanced in these understandings, subhanAllah, but Islam was in fact the very thing that sparked this work to happen. Now, many of you might be sitting back and going, whoa, wow, what happened to us, right? That's the $1 million question. But what's important here is to understand that our noble predecessors, our scholars, we're proud of these names. We hear about Ibn Sina, we hear about Razi, right? We hear about the canon of medicine was taught in European medical schools until the 1800s, right, of Ibn Sina. But there's even more to the story. So I'll share with you one more story about this, because all of this is setting the stage on what is the Islamic understanding of mental health. Well, there is a man in the 9th century, a scholar in the 9th century. His name was Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. This is somebody I've written about, and I have some papers in the medical journals about him, because when I was doing my research and all these different books, there was one time in my office where I had 120 manuscripts and books of different original manuscripts, right? And copies of original manuscripts, and reading in the Arabic, not just regular Arabic, but the ancient Arabic. And eventually we worked on some Persian works, and eventually on some Ottoman Turkish works, and so on. SubhanAllah, amazing. Well, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi writes in the 9th century, and he writes this book, small book. It's called Masalih al-Abdan wal-Anfus, translated today by Dr. Malik Badri as Sustenance of the Body and Soul. This book is very interesting. And what he has in the book also, I think, is really phenomenal, because he has what today, to me as a clinician who's trained today, looks at this book, and you look at chapter by chapter by chapter, and you see there's a chapter on each of the illnesses. What looks like we call today depression, what looks like what we call today anxiety, what looks like, and this is the one that caught my attention most, what we call today obsessions or obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. I was really intrigued by this, because I had learned in my medical school and in my psychiatry training at Stanford, I had learned that OCD was a modern illness. It was something that was only discovered in the 19th century. They even said the person who discovered it, his name was Robert Burton, and he wrote about it in his book, and he gave a case scenario and so on. This is what we learned. Well, I'm reading al-Balkhi, and I see what he's writing, section by section, and to me, as a clinician, I'm seeing the symptoms and the diagnosis of OCD, but in the 9th century. So at that point in time, my professor, there was a professor at Stanford who was one of the pioneers of OCD in the country. And Stanford in general was one of the 5 centers in the country that first opened up an OCD clinic. Well, the head of that clinic had an office right down the hall from me. And so I went over and knocked on the door. And I asked this professor, and I said, I found this book from the 9th century, and I think he's describing OCD. And he said, oh, no. I said, well, why? He said, because I'm a history buff. I wrote the book on OCD. And in fact, he did. In fact, he is the main author. If you go to the APA's website, he's the person who wrote the guidelines on OCD. And he said he starts pulling papers off of his shelf. A very, very nice man, but he was pulling papers off his shelf, and he said, here are the Greeks and here are the Romans, and no. And so I simply asked him, and I said, and he would politely, I said, but do you read Arabic? And he said, no. And he said, well, this is in Arabic, and maybe that's why you haven't come across it. He said, okay, fine. Why don't you go translate that chapter? At this point in time, Dr. Badri's book hadn't been, the book hadn't been translated yet. It was still the original Arabic. I said, fine. So we sat there, and I translated the book. When I translated it, I was even more amazed, because I saw that the criteria to me matched exactly what you would find in the DSM. The DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychiatry, and it's in its 5th edition. And in looking at the DSM, you have the symptoms. Any psychiatrist or psychologist, this is what we diagnose from. And when you look at those worldwide, globally agreed upon, and I looked at those criteria, and I looked at Balkhi from the 9th century, I'm finding that each and every point he said matches, point by point by point. I was amazed, beyond amazed. And so I went back to the professor, and I said to him, look, this is what I've translated, this is what I found. He was so amazed that he started to jumping up and down. You must publish this. You must, mashallah. And I said, okay, well, we will. And I credit him for encouraging us to publish. And I'll tell you, the publication was also a very interesting process, because when we submitted to the medical journals, even they thought, this is a big claim. One of them wrote back and said, this is unorthodox. Your paper was unorthodox. So much so that such big claims that we had to contact and hire historians of medicine to validate what you're writing. Because here I am changing the history of medicine, right? The way it's written in the books. And by the way, there are some scholars that have history of medicine that write about the Muslims, and they say, oh, and the Muslims came, right? And some who completely forget about us, who just skip right over us as though we didn't even exist. And some who go even further and will say, and yes, the Muslims translated the works of the Greeks, but they didn't add anything new onto the next group of people, which is very offensive and very problematic, and people who really do not like us, in short. So for me, when I submitted this and I hired the historians of medicine, it was very interesting, because then those historians of medicine wrote back, eventually after months, and they wrote back and they said, this changes the course of history. Yeah, we were so excited. Our lab celebrated. I have a research lab at Stanford called the Muslim Mental Health Lab. We have many lines of research. One of them is the historical line of research. We were so excited. We were happy. But what's more important is, even if you're not part of the Muslim community, this was an important discovery, because it meant that there were symptoms back in the 9th century that together, when they grouped together, are still called OCD. And they existed then in different geography, in a different historical context, and still was an illness that was, hung together and understood as one illness. So that was a big discovery for medicine. But even more so, it was important for our Muslim community. That when people in sessions and in my office and in working with the community members, when people say, no, this mental health thing, no, this is not part of our history. No, this is nonsense. Many of the things I myself said when I was younger. And then I tell them, have you heard about Balkhi? Have you heard about the hospitals? Have you heard about our history and our heritage? Suddenly people say, oh, subhanAllah. We had no idea. We didn't know our own history. We've forgotten our heritage. We need to dust the dust off of it. And we need to write our own narratives. Why is nobody writing about this? Because nobody cares to write about this. The Muslims themselves have to do this research, and themselves have to translate this, and themselves have to write about it. Now, why am I making a big fuss about this? Why do I go on and on about this topic? I go on and on about this topic because, sisters and brothers, it's really important to realize that the Muslims did not shy away from this. This was not taboo to us. We did not say, oh, no, that's not something, we need to treat. Just go pray more. Now, this is a point I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on and really talk about it in more depth, because I shared with you earlier, and you heard in the bio, I've trained formally in Sharia. I hold actual ijazahs. I'm considered to be a religious teacher in our community. May Allah bless and increase and accept. Ameen. Why am I making that point? Not to say, oh, look at me, a'udhu billah. Rather to say, even a person who is Sharia trained, I am telling you that it was the Quran and the Hadith and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ himself that sparked this kind of work. It is our heritage that actually says you must take into account the mental and emotional health and not ignore it. It is our tradition that says that you don't just bring just the sheikh or the imam to the patient, but you bring all the other 6 people that I counted. You bring the doctor and the nurse and the social worker and the dietitian and the nutritionist and the pharmacist and the religious leader. You bring all of them because we are a holistic tradition, And our treatment should also be holistic. So when you tell a person that has depression, they have barely gotten out of their bed or off the couch. They are so down and depressed. You can't figure them out. You don't know why they're doing this. And you keep saying to them, pray more, pray more. Dear sisters and brothers, that person hasn't even gone up in 2 or 3 days off the bed or off the couch to brush their own teeth or comb their own hair. That's how clinically depressed they are. And we're going to tell them to pray more? Wallahi, the people who are depressed and are good Muslims, strong Muslims, they'll say, I want to pray more, but I can't even brush my own teeth. So what is telling me to pray more going to do for me? It's not going to help. It's not going to help. But when they're feeling better, by all means, of course. And is prayer important? Absolutely. I'm not negating prayer. What I'm saying is our tradition is a holistic tradition. Let me give you an even deeper example of what I mean. One time I was asked, like your dear community here, I was asked to go and criteria to me matched exactly what you thought. Sorry about that. I went to go teach a topic on mental health in a Muslim community, in a masjid. And right before my talk, very similar to this talk, this is several years back, right before this talk, I was approached by a couple of women of the community, and they said, I'm so glad you're here because we had a terrible thing happen in our community. And I said, khair, inshallah. The people who invited me didn't tell me the backstory. I didn't know this. But some people in the audience came and told me. They said just a few months ago, there was a sister in the community. She had just given birth. And after she gave birth, she felt very down, very depressed. And the people they said to her, you should go talk to the imam. Maybe he can give you some dhikr. Maybe he can give you some Quran to read. Maybe he can help you. And so she went to the imam with her little baby, and she went and said, I'm having a really hard time. And the imam tried. He really did. He gave her Quran, he gave her some dhikr, he gave her some awrad, and told her how to do ruqya on herself and so on. And she came back to him a second time. And she came back to him a third time. And each time she said, I'm not getting better. I'm not getting better. It's getting worse, actually. And he just said, here are some more afkar. Here are some more awrad. Well, I hate to tell you the story. It's a terrible story. But it's a case in point. Here is a strong, practicing Muslim woman who prays regularly, who wears her hijab, who fasts for Ramadan, who does, okay? But she gave birth. And she had this terrible, terrible dip in her mood. So much so that she was saying, I don't think I can take care of this baby. I don't think I deserve this baby. I think I shouldn't have this baby. I mean, all kinds of thoughts like this. And she was saying, look, the extra prayers aren't helping me. What do I do? What do I do? And all she was being given was more prayers. Nobody apparently thought to tell her, go seek out a professional. Go to a doctor. There is a name for the illness you are experiencing right now called postpartum depression. And it's not because you're a bad Muslim. It's not because you have weak faith. It's not because you're not praying enough. It's because your hormones dropped after you gave birth, biological condition. And it's a well-known condition that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 women will experience postpartum depression at some point in one of their pregnancies. Now, all of us know at least 4 to 5 women who've given birth. Probably 50 women. Can you imagine how many have actually experienced postpartum depression and were brushed off? How many were experienced postpartum depression and were told, go pray more and just have dhikr? How many, and not, again, prayer is great, dhikr is important, but this is a biological, hormonal condition. Just like diabetes is a biological, hormonal condition. Nobody says to them, bad, shame on the pancreas, and no one says, no, here's some dhikr of Quran, read this. No, we say go rush to the doctor, get your insulin levels checked. If you need to take diabetes medication, take it. And if you need to take actual insulin shots, if it's that bad, take them. And we encourage them and we push them and we tell them you have to. Here is a hormonal biological condition that caused her depression. And she went from postpartum depression to the very feared and rare condition of postpartum psychosis. Sisters and brothers, she took her own life and that of her child. This is heavy. This is very heavy discussion. Why am I saying that? Because postpartum depression can go to an extreme if it's untreated as postpartum psychosis. And suicide and homicide are both something that can happen. May Allah protect me and you. But it was ignored. And she was not sent to the right kind of professionals and care. And with all due respect to the religious leadership, it wasn't sufficient. Just like you don't tell a diabetes patient, go to the imam, you tell them go to the doctor. But somehow when it comes to mental health, or when people say my mood is down, I'm not feeling well, people say feel better, yallah, get up, come on, right? Or they say get off that bed already. Or they say do some dhikr. I don't know where the wires cross, but I'll tell you something. If this was part of our Muslim Sharia and tradition, our noble predecessors wouldn't have created Bimaristans and Dar Shifas and whole programs and whole institutions and paid zakat money and put awqaf money into these institutions. They would have sent them to the shuyukh. They understood that early on because Islam is a holistic tradition. Where did we lose this? You see, we've lost this. And this is an important point that I'm trying to make. That there is a lot of stigma that shouldn't be there. There's a taboo nature of these discussions that shouldn't be there, right? There is also a discussion that somehow, that somebody that has mental illness, that it's purely a faith-based or spiritual issue, and that's not the case. In fact, what we know, right, in modern medicine, we know it's something called multifactorial causes for mental illness. It could be biological, like the example of postpartum depression, but it could also be genetic. It could be something that's in your genes. And I do this all the time with my patients, and I say, who in your family has this? Often the answer is, no, nobody. And then we talk, and I say, was there once an aunt or an uncle, maybe a grandma who, they said about her, oh, she never really at the end of her life, she spent a lot of time in her bed, or, this cousin that nobody ever wants to talk about, right? Families have genes that pass from generation to generation, and it's not someone's fault. We deal with it. We treat it. There are treatments. Postpartum depression is absolutely 100% treatable. So it's very sad when you hear these stories, because it got to such an extent that it actually caused fatality, right? Or, so you have biological, you have genetic, or environmental. There are so many Muslims here today in the US who are where our home origins were, where we came from, where our parents or ourselves immigrated from, were war-torn places of a lot of trauma, a lot of upheaval, a lot of, and we came here for safety. But even after coming here, there were issues of acculturation, Islamophobia, right? Difficulties financially. Here, I know you're in Southern California, we're here in the Bay Area. It's expensive up here, right? And then COVID and quarantine and a million things are going on, civil unrest. So many things that cause people turbulence and tribulation. SubhanAllah. Environmental causes. So it may not be biological, may not be genetic, but it may be the causes that a person has experienced in their life environmentally. And it also could be religious or spiritual. So multifactorial. And our scholars understood that. And they built whole institutions around all the different types of reasons why mental health can happen. And they built treatments around this. So why am I making this point? Why am I pushing, this point more and more and more? Because I want to tell you that people that have, mental illness, that experience this, aren't crazy. They are people who, like you and me. They are people who were very normal, gave birth, and ended up with postpartum depression because their hormones took a dip. They are people who otherwise are healthy people but experience a big trauma, maybe even just a car accident in their life that caused it. This is important to think about where all the different causes for mental illness are, and to really understand a little bit about how Islam views it. The way Islam views it is holistic and says, whichever way it comes in, work on that and treat that, which is why we had that very, connected kind of care team that I referred to earlier. Now, I also want to tell you something very important to this. I want to tell you that I don't want to just tell you all the problems without giving you solutions. We're talking about how there are big big progress kind of being made, alhamdulillah. I would say definitely in the last 10 years, and absolutely in the last even 5 years, there's a big difference. The very mere fact that, mashallah, Salam, Islamic Center, and some of the others, mashallah, are asking, reaching out for talks related to mental health is key. This was never really the case when I was growing up. I never ever attended and we were, mosque-going people, masjid-going people all our life. Never heard once a talk on mental health growing up, or anything about our heritage, right? Or anybody talking about emotions and feelings, none of that, right? SubhanAllah. So something is changing. Something is changing in the broader society, and something is changing also within the Muslim society. And the field of what we call broadly of Muslim mental health is really growing. Look, at Stanford, there's an entire, and it's the first, and main kind of academic home of the study of Muslim mental health nationally, potentially even globally, this topic, right? This is a great advancement. Then you talk about, for many of us, we're interested in, well, if Balkhi and the like talked about and he has a whole sections on not just diagnosing and classifying, but also treatments. And the treatments are so interesting. I'll tell you, since we talked about OCD, I'll go back to that example. If you look at his section there, or even on phobias, which is another paper I had written, and you look at that, he says, look, you should do 3 things. You should talk to the trusted individual who can help you and guide you through this. And many people say, definitely Dr. Malik Badri claims that Al-Balkhi, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, was likely the first talk therapist. The person who first advocated for talk therapy. This is part of our tradition. Number 2, that you take, and he talks about certain herbal kind of remedies, and basically today what we call medication. And thirdly, that you go through Islamic wa'adh, kind of these, advice that is given on how to better yourself and your condition. All 3. So we too wanted to look into how do you do all 3. So now there's something like a revival, if you will, of Islamic psychology. This is very exciting. Just like there's a revival in like the business world on Islamic finance, and people looking and saying, maybe the ribawi interest system is a terrible idea. Why don't we look at the Muslim non-interest system and see if it can benefit us as Muslims, because it's part of our tradition after all, and even benefit the non-Muslim, right? Same with Islamic psychology. There is a look again and saying, look, modern psychology and psychiatry is so fixated on the brain, the mind. It's a neuroscience. And nobody's talking about Al-Imam al-Ghazali. He has a very beautiful model that we talk about. And I'm going to share with you my book here very shortly that we've written, coming out this summer, alhamdulillah, actually next month. It's on pre-order right now on Amazon, published by Routledge. And we called it Introducing Traditionally Integrated Islamic Psychotherapy. Because we were amazed by the work that we found. Imam al-Ghazali says, yeah, the mind is part of the story, but so is the qalb, the heart. Like the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that talks about the mudgha, right? That there is an organ, there is a piece of flesh, right? And there's a piece in the body that if it is wholesome, then the whole body is whole. And that is the heart. So Imam Ghazali puts the qalb in the middle and says the mind is connected, but so are the emotions, ihsas, so are the ruh, right? The soul, and so is the nafs, the self, that sometimes pulls you down, right? The nafs, right? The different kinds of nafs that are talked about in the Quran, and nafs al-lawama, nafs al-ammara, the suit, right? And nafs al-mutma'inna, right? These different terms. And this whole beautiful holistic model. So we said, look, it can't be that people go to the modern day psychologist or psychiatrist and only wants to talk about the mind, and only wants to talk about medication, and only wants to talk about therapy that's devoid of God and devoid of spirituality. Well, that's not going to help anybody. That's not going to help the observant Muslim who actually practices Islam in their daily life. And when a calamity happens to them, they say, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There is no power or might except for Allah. But when a calamity overcomes them, or tribulation overcomes them, they remind themselves what it says in the Quran. قُلْ لَن يُصِيبَنَا إِلَّا مَا كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَنَا. That calamity will not befall us except what was already written for us. This is the Muslim belief. But if you go to the therapist and they're like, no, we don't talk about religion and God here. You're like, wait, here's COVID-19 happening, here's quarantine, here's this big thing happening. And when I'm stuck, I call on the greater power. I call on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's not just us, by the way. This is why Islamic psychology is important for everybody, because the Pew Research Center that does all the studies on, religion in American society, after COVID-19, you should check out on their website. They have a study that just came out just a few weeks ago, and it talks about America across the board, Americans across the board. And it shows how there are people who had never turned to religion or were not people of faith or religion, who after COVID started to turn to religion and faith because it was so overwhelming, the situation. So here are the Muslims, who this is part of our tradition. So we thought to ourselves, those of us who are in the field, I was asked earlier, am I the only one in the field? Absolutely not. Alhamdulillah, there's a good group of us that are working in this field. And we thought to ourselves, we must be able to do what our noble predecessors did. We must build institutions that are able to bring in modern clinical science and all of its advancements, but also tie in our religious tradition and tie in Islam into the therapy process, the healing process, and create institutions like our noble predecessors did, and even use zakat funds to help those who are zakat eligible to get care, who can't otherwise access good quality care, just like our noble predecessors did. So born was the idea of the Khalil Center, which I'm really excited to share with you, because I said I would share with you solutions, not just problems. And part of this, a group of people about 10 years ago in Chicago started the Khalil Center. Dr. Human Kashavarzi is the founder, and he created the first Khalil Center in Chicago, and some years later met me and thought we were thinking along the same lines and said, how about we try growing the Khalil Center? And alhamdulillah, in 2015, the first office of Khalil Center was born in California. And then I found, since then, every single year we've opened up a new office, and then another one, and then another one. Because, alhamdulillah, I didn't know if this idea would really take within our communities, if people would be interested in this, if they would be willing to come out for care and for help. But within that first year, we had a small suite next to the masjid, and the masjid invited us. They wanted us to be there. The big masjid in Santa Clara, the biggest masjid in the Bay Area here, called MCA, Muslim Community Association, invited us. And we had a 2-room suite. And in that 1 year, it got so busy, people were booking on top of each other, we had to open a second branch. We opened up in Pleasanton in the MCC location, and then eventually opened up a standalone clinic, which is our headquarters in Union City. And we're on college campuses. We are the main mental health providers for Muslim students at UC Berkeley, and at the Zaytuna College, and on certain Islamic schools in our area. And then LA area opened its office, so you have an office near you, but it's in the valley. Hopefully we'll have an LA proper office soon, inshallah, under direction of Sheikh Suhail Mullah. And their offices open now in New York, and also in Toronto, and of course the original ones that are in Chicago. And all of our therapists do teletherapy. This is even before COVID. We always offer teletherapy, and after COVID, everybody offers teletherapy. So you have like 50 or so Muslim clinicians who are all part of this Khalil Center network between all the different offices, and they do therapy. And if this is what you prefer, Islamically integrated therapy, this is what they offer you. And for somebody who doesn't want the Islam integrated in, there's standard regular therapy you might find at a standard therapy office also available. And the financial model is that you can use your insurance, you can use your sliding scale based on your annual income if you don't have the insurance that's taken there, or the zakat financial aid package that makes it accessible to every person in our community, young, old, children, adults, and also all the language groups that are spoken. So our therapists, for example, in our Bay Area offices, they speak, of course the English, but also the Arabic, the Urdu, Farsi, Pashto, Dari, Spanish, right? They have a lot of the main languages that are Muslim cultural groups and their languages, so that it's accessible to the people. To me, this was very important, and this is backed by a lot of research. And like I said, the book is coming out this summer, mashallah, that goes through the model of how we do this care. And it's 100% professional. It's 100% within the frame of accepted in professional modern psychology and psychiatry. And in addition, it integrates Islam in, because it's not just the Muslims who are on this cusp or this wave. Also, there's Christian psychologists who are doing the same, Jewish psychologists who are doing the same for their communities. So others are recognizing, look, you have to really talk about religion and cultural issues when you talk to patients. Just this morning, I did a whole training for the Jewish Family Services on how to work with Muslim clients. They reached out, they wanted to know. But they said, we have a lot of Muslim clients. What do we do? A lot of them are refugees being resettled. What do we do? So these conversations are being had even by non-Muslims. So alhamdulillah, with this, I wanted to really share some of the advancements that are happening, alhamdulillah, in the field of Islamic psychology and Muslim mental health. But I also wanted to share with you our very rich heritage and how we now need to reconnect the dots, right? And unfortunately, with colonization and with the fall, of the Ottoman Empire and eventual colonization that happened, when all those colonial forces came into our countries, so did their thoughts and ideas about mental health and about everything else too. And we adapted them and we took them wholesale as somehow they were more advanced than ours. But it turned out that we were well more advanced than they ever were. SubhanAllah, talk therapy and music therapy and, whole institutions, SubhanAllah, right? I'm really excited to tell you that, inshallah, very soon, in my Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab, in partnership with the work of the Khalil Center, in partnership with the Yaqeen Institute, we'll be putting out a series very soon on telling you a lot more in depth about this history that I'm talking about, because I think Muslims really need to know this. But I hope this at least was a beginning of a conversation about not just our heritage, but also our current state as Muslims, and giving some resources and solutions to where to go. So there's the institutions like Khalil Center, but I also want to tell you there are also helplines that are Muslim-based. The Khalil Center has one, like a helpline that's a phone or a chat box that people can access on our website. But in addition, there are others, organizations that are doing the same and are really focusing on this. So I hope, inshallah, we'll see what questions come in the Q&A box and take them. But I hope this was a good beginning of the conversation. Alhamdulillah.
Ustad Dr. Rania Awad, this was a wonderful conversation. You were able to let the modern psychology with the classical Islamic teachings, and they were founded in the Islamic heritage in the 9th century. Beautiful discovery. Really congratulate you on that. A lot of congratulations, because what we are struggling as Muslim communities, as you have said, is first we go to the Imam and trying to find a thing about that, but there's also the other aspect of this, which you elaborated in your talk. A quick question, the first question comes, alhamdulillah, there's a lot of interest to your talk and a lot of questions, but we won't be able to answer them all because of the time restraint. The first question is a quick question. If there are any reference resources, books, podcasts, websites, which integrates Islam to modern psychology, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so definitely look at the KhalilCenter.com as the KhalilCenter.com, and also the book that I was referring to. I think, inshallah, you're putting it up as the a link to the book that's coming out this summer, which is exactly that, integrating traditional Islamic concepts into modern psychology practices. And you can also look at the lab website, the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab website, because also there we talk about a lot of the research and some of the publications that have come out of that as well.
Yeah, thank you. The second question comes, how can we bring the modern Muslim community the mental health resources and education they need?
By doing exactly what you're doing here. I mean, this very talk is a first step. Educating, talking about, breaking the taboos. The second step would actually be to bring services. And, one of the things that the Khalil Center isn't just a clinic that does services, but it also has an education branch, which does talks like this, and it goes around the country and gives lectures, workshops, imam trainings. And I actually recommend that institutions, Islamic centers, Islamic schools even, and community centers, Muslim community centers, bring these trainings to their organization. I can't tell you how beneficial it was to have the imams attend an 8-hour certification training that at the end they were able to figure out, when do I need to refer, like that very difficult case I told you earlier about, when have I reached my limit and I need to refer to the professionals. right? And that's a very important skill to learn. So I recommend all these. The second step would be the education for the community. And the third step would be, of course, opening up actual services and making that available to the community.
Wonderful, thank you. And the third question comes from a teenager, I suppose. How would you start a discussion like this with parents who tell you not to be depressed, just smile? Also, how would you deal with suicidal thoughts?
Yeah, the first part of your question is so important. And I hear this, I hear you loud and clear. And, I would say to them, all the things I shared with you today, kind of very respectfully and very politely, but I would talk about the heritage, because you can't really argue with the heritage, right? You also can't, how about this? I'm going to give you 2 hadith. One I said before, and one is one I haven't said yet. And so when you speak to your parents and you say, do we not have from the Quran and the Sunnah what we believe in? They'll say yes, inshallah. So you say, well, Abu Hurairah narrated that the Prophet ﷺ said, there is no disease that Allah has created except that He has created its remedy. And that's in Bukhari. And okay, so if this is something I feel down about and there's an actual potential condition, and that your second question is about suicide, which is even more serious, right? And preventable, right? Then you say this hadith and it's like, oh, there's a remedy. Where's the remedy? Well, with the professionals who know how to treat it. The second hadith is, the Prophet ﷺ was asked, O Messenger of Allah, should we seek medical treatment for our illnesses? And he replied, yes, you should seek medical treatment because Allah, the Exalted, has let no disease exist without providing its cure, except for one ailment, and that is old age, and that's infirmity. So he says basically we can't cure old age, everyone's going to age, but everything else Allah has created a cure for and eventually a treatment.
Yeah, I was intrigued by when you said Imam training. Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by that Imam's training?
The Imam training? Yeah, the Imam training is something Khalil Center created because we're very much an Islamically integrated psychotherapy space, a wellness center. And we knew that for the Imams, you had to speak their language in order to really get through. And so, not very different than the person who asked about his parents, to be honest with you. There's a lot of the same mentality, just read some Quran, just smile, right? And so this training is basically an 8-hour, full day certification. At the end, they get a certificate. And part of it is discussion, and part of it is role play. They role play, if this person comes, they bring their child who has an addiction, and they say, help me, right? And they role play, how do you talk to that family? How do you talk, or a kid who comes through and says, I feel suicidal. How do you role play this very serious situation when you don't have the capacity to really deal with it properly? So can I share with you, if it's okay, a really quick story about the Imam training? Here in the Bay Area, we tried to do the Imams training, and it was hard to get many Imams at the same time. They're very, very, very busy. Some they're not interested in mental health, and others are interested, but they're very busy. Well, in one training, it was 2 days back to back, and I was doing training that was mandatory for a certain group of people, and amongst them was an Imam, and he came with his laptop, and he was very, uninterested, and he was working on his laptop, working for the whole first hour. It's 8 hours. And by the second hour, I saw that he was looking about his laptop, kind of interested in what we were saying. And by the third hour, he had shut the laptop and was really, really listening. And at the very end of the day, by the 8th hour, he opened his laptop up again. And I thought, how strange. He started writing on his laptop. And at the end of the training, I asked, how did this go? How did people benefit? And he said, listen, I did everything in my power not to come here because I've been an Imam for 30 years in my life. And I thought I have everything. I learned everything I ever needed to know. But today I realized I didn't know what I didn't know. And I was writing furiously to all my Imam friends to tell them to come tomorrow and take this training because they have to be here. And the next day, 40 Imams showed up to take this training because he said how important this was for them. So there's a lot of work we have to do in our community, but we'll get there, inshallah.
Exactly. A lot of people are watching you. There's a distinguished professor that I know that just gave you an A+ on your talk. Another question comes to mind. What is the clear definition of mental health, and how much connection and related with brain health?
Sure, great question. Yes, there is definitely a connection, of course, with brain health. And if you want to talk about, because mental health is it's a very broad terminology, underneath which you have pathological conditions or specific clinical conditions like depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, and so on. But under mental health, you also have all of emotional health as well. So what I mean by that is maybe somebody does not meet the criteria for depression or anxiety. However, they're going through a difficult time in their marriage, or they're going through a difficult time raising their children and parenting. They still should come for therapy. They should still seek out mental health support, even though they don't have a diagnosis. So at Khalil Center, we do the whole thing, whether it's an actual diagnosis, clinical, or whether it's a non-clinical issue that needs therapy and support. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. And our last question, if time permits, when and why this early Islamic holistic approach to well-being, mental, affectual, physical, and spiritual, was compartmentalized and then pathologized? What have been the consequences of these?
Very good. Yes, the concept of what happened when it got all pathologized. That's exactly what I experienced. I feel like that's exactly what I experienced, where everything was trying to be, made into a clinical. So the very point I just made about how certain conditions are actual illnesses, like they hang together, they have actual symptoms, they have actual treatments, right? They're clinical conditions. But there's other conditions that are not necessarily clinical, or somebody needs to just talk something out with somebody. So here's how I'm going to answer this question. I'm going to tell you why we named our center Khalil. So you know the word Khalil. Khalil in Arabic means the good friend or companion to somebody. You know the hadith that talks about al-mar'u ala dini khalili, right? The person is on the religion of his close companion or friend. You also know that the Sayyidina Ibrahim was Khalilullah, the friend of Allah, right? So we know this term Khalil. And the reason we decided to call a Khalil Center, and we see ourselves as Islamic psychologists and therapists as Khalil, is because we feel that this is the work of the Khalil. It's the person who it walks with you on the path and helps guide you to the right decision, but doesn't tell you what to do. They're there to help and guide you, the Khalil. So we don't see everything as pathology. When things are clinical conditions, yes, they are. But when not, and this is the spirit of the Islamic tradition. We've always had these people in our Islamic past and history. So they didn't have to always be doctors. But today, it's governed by a clinical practice. So today, they have to be people who are trained as psychologists, therapists, psychiatrists to do this work.
Yeah, the quick question about the Khalil Center, is it only open to our state in California or open to other states as well?
It's open because now it's a teletherapy, so it's all virtual therapy, although the places where we have physical offices, you can go in person and get therapy. So Northern California, Southern California, Toronto, New York, Chicago. However, teletherapy can access by anybody.
I see. And another question comes is, in immigrant communities, even if members are open to the idea of getting psychological help, there's tendency to get help only from the Muslim psychologists. What do you comment on that?
It's a very good question. And I'll tell you something. I have seen both things. However, I would say that the majority seem to want to get help from Muslim practitioners. And let me explain to you why. The people who want to go to non-Muslim clinicians, often they say, either they couldn't find somebody who was Muslim of the same faith, or they wanted something outside of their community. And we respect that. And that's why all professionals have to have professional, training of how to work with cultural competence. However, the vast majority, we ask actually at the Khalil Center, we have some surveys on intake a lot of data that we collect, especially because we're trying to make sure that this is evidence-based medicine that we're practicing. So on intake, we ask some very specific questions about, have you ever been to therapy before? Have you ever gone to a non-Muslim therapist before? How important is it that your therapist shares your same religious tradition? And how important is it that your therapist integrates religion into your therapy? So the first few questions, over 50%, over 50, over 50, majority. The last question about integrating Islam into the clinical practice, 98%. So that tells you between strongly agree and agree, 98%. So why do the Muslims do this? Because they feel, like many people I've talked to, either that the therapist in front of them isn't fully understanding the issue or the culture, or maybe even blaming or discriminating against the faith or the culture. And so this is probably a very strong reason why.
Ustadha, can we take a couple of more questions, because it keeps coming in if time permits. Are you okay with that?
Sure, a few more minutes. Sure, no problem.
Okay. Do you attribute the separation of Muslim mental health and physical health to colonialism and introduction of Cartesian duality?
Yeah, the Cartesian duality. Good. Somebody's reading good, really doing their research here, which is excellent. Yes, the duality, I think, is a very important subject. In fact, this last semester at Stanford, we just finished our quarter, and I was teaching a course called Islamic Psychology, which is probably one of the first really in the country, and certainly one of the first at an institution like Stanford. So we're very lucky to have had this course, and it'll be ongoing. And one of the things we actually study is the concept of, the Cartesian duality. This is exactly what we study, and how very much it has influenced. This concept is very important in the discussion of what happened. Why did this happen, and where did it come about? So yes, colonialism, the duality story, right? And there are other factors too as to why we've kind of lost our heritage and really great advancements over time. So good. So I give that person a gold star.
Yeah. And another question, and our last, hopefully, I'm an imam myself. How can I provide an environment for the youth or for the adults for them to trust me and comfortably open up to me if they have suicidal thoughts or drug addictions?
Yes, thank you for asking that, Imam. I really appreciate that. And I want to say, trust is I would say in the list of things, trust tends to be number one, honestly. And part of that is having that listening open ear. Part of the trust factor also is figuring out how to refer them to care. Sometimes people are not fully opening up because they don't think you can fully understand or help. Sometimes they don't open up because they feel like they might be judged, or they might be told haram, halal, haram, halal, haram and halal. And there are times where, we have at Stanford Lab, we have a whole line of research on the topic of suicide specifically. And we have some very key papers that are about, inshallah, to be published and make dua for us. And one very important project called the Suicide Prevention, Intervention, and Postvention Toolkit. And the reason that's important is because we go in great depth to explain how religious leaders, community leaders, especially imams, how they talk about this. We've even created whole khutbahs on this topic. And also, and so many communities who unfortunately have had a suicide in their community, they have taken this training from us in the toolkit of how you say what you say. Sometimes it's the language. Sometimes it's the way it comes through. Sometimes it's the feeling judged. Sometimes it's the feeling like, there are times in prevention work we actually talk about the halal and the haram. But in postvention, after the fact, it's not the time and place for that discussion. So inshallah, I hope the papers we're publishing in the toolkit, which we hope to make widely available to everybody, will be useful, inshallah. So I hope that's a start. But definitely lending the ear and making sure that you know how to refer. As an imam, I would recommend, sorry, I'm taking one extra minute here to explain this. I would have a whole list, honestly, even put up on my wall on my desk, of all the Muslim helplines. Khalil Center, Nasiha, Stones to Bridges, Bismillah. There's a few others that Amala, right? There's a few different helplines that are Muslim specific, and of course the National Suicide Hotline, which is 24 hours a day. None of the other Muslim ones are fully 24 hours a day, but the national one is. And I would have that actually welcomes a person to say, oh wow, this imam is willing. So one time we actually created this, or I won't mention where and who, one of the therapists created this list and said, here imam, this is an important thing that I think you should have, because the youth, if they want to come and if they ever open up about this, you have something to give them to help them. And he said, oh, I've never done this. And he opened up his desk and stuck the sheet in his desk and closed it again in his drawer. Of course, no one's going to want to talk to you, right, about this if they feel like you're just going to judge. But remember, suicide is preventable. And there are signs. People start saying things or doing things that indicate they're not well and they need to see a professional. So having the referral base and also having the openness and the trust is key to this discussion.
Thank you. Another question, and last is, do you have any support in the Khalil Center in Turkish language?
Turkish language, mashallah. I'll tell you something very exciting. Not only do we have support in Turkish language, because some of our providers, yes, actually do speak Turkish, but even better than that, we have the first international branch of the Khalil Center open now in Istanbul, mashallah, at Ibn Khaldun University. And the first branch there's a Khalil Center training site that the psychologists that are training in Islamic psychology have a clinic now of Khalil Center. And our executive director, Dr. Human, actually travels to Istanbul every year to do the trainings there. And we have a good exchange between us and the Turkish folks, alhamdulillah. So yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, mashallah. Really, I'm flabbergasted to know that Khalil Center exists and you pioneered the way for these works that reminds us of our Islamic heritage. Wedding with the modern psychology, really great work. I appreciate it. Make dua for you and Center every day. Jazakallah khairan, really, Ustadha Rania Awad, for opening up new doors for many Muslims who have given up on themselves. Really great work.
Alhamdulillah.
Duas with you, prayers with you. And to our audience, thank you for being with us at this week's Salam Islamic Center talk with Dr. Ustadha. I had a hard time reading your bio. How you were able to accomplish all that. Really great work, mashallah. May God continue your great work and become in abundance, inshallah, in the future for our teenagers, for our community, and for this country. Thanks so much.
بارك الله فيكم. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.